Hi everyone, and welcome to this session of the PhenoLab. Today, it's my big pleasure to have with us Professor Shaun Gallagher. Professor Gallagher is the Lillian and Maury Moss Professor of Excellence in Philosophy at the University of Memphis and a Professorial Fellow at the School of Liberal Arts at the University of Wollongong in Australia. He was an Humboldt Foundation Annelies Meyer Research Fellow between 2012 2018 and has held honorary professorships at Tromsø University in Norway, Durham in UK, and Copenhagen in Denmark, as well as visiting positions at Cambridge, Lyon, Paris, Berlin, Oxford, and Rome. His areas of research include phenomenology, philosophy of mind, embodied cognition, social cognition, and concept of selves. His publications include Action and Interaction, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, Performance Art, the Venetian Lecture, published in 2021, The Phenomenological Mind, published in 2021, the third edition of this monumental book, and Activist Interventions, Rethinking the Mind, published by Oxford in 2017, and the Neurophenomenology of Awe and Wonder, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015, as well as Phenomenology, always published by Palgrave Macmillan, and How the Body Shapes the Mind, published by Oxford University Press in 2005. He is co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of 4E Cognition, and he is editor-in-chief of the journal Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences. His forthcoming book, The Self and Its Disorders, will be published by Oxford University Press in 2023. So, Professor Gallagher today will present a talk entitled Causality in Enactive Approaches to Psychiatry. Thank you, Shaun. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks again for inviting me. I'm happy to be virtually present. Causality in enactive approaches to psychiatry. I'm really drawing on two of my publications, one with a very similar title, Integration and Causality in Enactive Approaches to Psychiatry, and another that may be relevant if we get that far. Has to do with autism spectrum disorder, and I'll give you links later to these papers if you find them interesting. As a brief outline here, I will start by talking about the integration problem in psychiatry, and go on to a proposal concerning enactive integration. I'll try to outline a threefold method for exploring some of these issues. And then if I have time, we'll have to see how that goes. I'll try to say something about autism spectrum disorder as a test case. So first, the integration problem in psychiatry. People have recognized this problem in a number of different ways. And we have a number of different approaches to try to solve the problem. One approach would be considered narrow in the kind of technical sense of narrow as used in philosophy of mind, which means in the head, brain-based type approaches. Other approaches are wide, which means more embodied and concerning the environment. So Philip Gerrans, I think, gives a nice example of a narrow approach in the context of explaining delusion. He proposes an interdisciplinary integration to explain how the mind configures itself in response to incoming information. And he proposes I think, a relatively standard two-factor account based on an internal hierarchy of levels arranged on a vertical axis. And the idea is that likely something goes wrong at a neural level, and then there are bottom-up effects, so that something like a pre-reflective awareness, suddenly one has an anomalous experience as a result of the neural processes going wrong. And then that motivates something like a reflective confabulation. He puts this in terms of a default mechanism for reflection. So he's talking about a kind of bottom-up and then top-down type of a set of processes. One challenge for this type of integrative account is precisely how to integrate these different models that you find, for example, in neuroscience. And he wants to, in fact, use notions of neural network theory and also predictive processing. He wants to talk a little bit about phenomenology. And then he also thinks that cognitive and narrative type analyses can help us understand the reflective confabulation. So the challenge is precisely how to integrate, and this is the integration problem, or at least one version of it. All of these models depend upon the concept of levels, and in the end, I think Ahrens ends up with something like a mishmash of levels, and he seems to admit it. He says, the notion of levels is ubiquitous in scientific explanation, but not everyone uses it in the same way. It can refer to ordering relationships between theories, or the objects of theories ordered by size or complexity. For example, cells are smaller and less complex than the organs they make up. It can refer to functional analyses. So, for example, vision as a higher level property than edge detection, or it can refer to levels of mereological containment. For example, parts are at a lower level than wholes. We get an example of a wider type of integration in a kind of phenomenological psychiatry approach. You might find this in Louis Sas. He draws both on phenomenological psychiatry and George Engel's biopsychosocial model. And he proposes what he calls a bio-pheno-social integrative account, where the bio has to do with the neural processes, phenomenology, of course, having to do with our experience, and social factors also playing a role in psychopathology. Sas worries, however, about how to explain the relations among these various component processes. Are they organized in a hierarchical fashion? Are they causally related, or are they constitutive of the phenomenon? And he says, these questions pertain to theoretical issues that are difficult or even impossible to settle, such as overall attitudes towards holistic explanation, or the enigmatic mind-body problem, which is generally viewed as utterly insoluble, he says. Also, Sanaka Dahan has recently offered an alternative, a wide enactive model of integration. And not unlike the bio-pheno-social model of Sas, it includes phenomenological, social, and neurobiological components. Dahan importantly adds the existential dimension, which he takes to be the idea that the person is reflectively aware of her own situation and can take an evaluative attitude towards it. And that has a significant difference, that makes a significant difference. Now, Dahan proposes a view of integration based on what she terms organizational causality. And she argues that discussions of reciprocal or circular causality that you find in some enactivist authors, such as Francisco Varela, Thomas Fuchs, these don't go far enough. And what she's thinking is that reciprocal is, a two-way type of relationship between neural processes and experiential aspects of the phenomenon. But it's a pretty simple, there's likely more than just two factors that we have to consider. So maybe the circular is a little bit better, but even the circular divides things up into levels. So, for example, Thomas Fuchs describes it this way. He says, mental illnesses are marked by a disruption of vertical circular causality, That is, the interplay between lower level processes and higher faculties of the organism. And then once we start talking about levels here, then there's the complexity that we saw Gerens expressing. Exactly what do we mean by levels and how are things really related? De Haan argues that organizational causality allows us to move away from the idea of levels. So we can conceive causal relations to be neither bottom up nor top down. So first, let's ask, what is the motivation for moving away from explanations in terms of levels to what we might call a level-free explanation? And even if we acknowledge that the concept of hierarchical levels has been productive in discussions of diagnosis and treatment in psychiatry, and many people actually point this out, there is still no consensus on the dimensions to be included or how general or specific they should be. There, however, are additional motivations for moving away from explanations in terms of levels to a level-free explanation. Specifically, level models lead to reductionist, fragmented, and linear explanations. And Sannika de Haan does point to the problem that they are very tempting for a reductionist move. So here's the first problem: the tendency towards a bio or neuroreductionist strategy. So, for example, interpretations of the biopsychosocial model leads to ideas that the biological level should be treated as more basic, and the real it would be the real or root cause of psychological and social problems. And this gets reflected very pragmatically in measurement choices, diagnostic focus, and then treatment selection. So that reductionist temptation is the first problem. Second, Engel himself points out that different levels need to be investigated by different specialized disciplines. An investigator is generally obliged to select one system level on which to concentrate, he says. This, however, leads to a fragmented explanation. You have independent research ongoing, diagnosis, treatment, all in a certain way from the disciplinary perspective, with no clarity about connections. And that, in fact, defeats the idea of an integrated approach. A recent article by Koenigs and Stilwell point out this problem. Finally, level models tend to be implemented in a linear manner. They talk about unidirectional causal pathways that are assumed to exist between involved factors, which may be considered as really insensitive to very complex contexts or temporal unfolding. And thus they treat the phenomena as strictly decomposable, and that leads back to the idea of reduction. So de Haan thinks that organizational causality will allow us to eliminate talk of levels, but she associates this concept with the idea of emergence as fusion. Here she's following Paul Humphrey's idea of emergence as fusion. And he describes it this way: when emergence occurs, the lower level property instances go out of existence in producing the higher level emergent instances. To clarify this, de Haan offers the analogy of a cake. All of the ingredients, even if they start out as differentiated, once they're sort of baked, they become fused in such a way that one can no longer distinguish sugar from flour or from the flavorings or other ingredients. And this is a cake without layers, right? The layers might be confusing. So we're basically, this kind of fusion is what she's pointing to as the elimination of levels. So this seems to be an important factor, an important idea for her. But with this idea of organizational causality and fusion, we go from a mishmash of levels and gerunds to a fusion in which not only levels, but all useful distinctions seem to disappear. And in psychiatric practice, one needs a model of integration that does not subvert useful distinctions among the neurobiological, the phenomenological, the social, and the existential, to use DeHaan's own terms. So this, I think, still leaves the problem of integration. The fusion that we end up with on this model doesn't really help, and really is not very productive, again, in the psychiatric context. So what we need is, I think, a solution that rejects the idea of levels for all the reasons I outlined. Levels are so fraught with fragmentation, so limited to linearity, and so tempting of reductionism, right? And why should we say something like the neural is more basic than the social if they're both playing a causal role? So what we need is a solution that leaves intact important distinctions among different contributing factors. So a number of people have started to move away from level-based explanation. And I'm not going to talk about do a review of this, but I do want to focus on one account, which is an account offered by James Woodward in a volume in 2020. And he considers the idea of levels eliminativism, which he defines as the thought that we would be better off avoiding level talk entirely. Nonetheless, he frames his analysis in terms of level talk anyway, because it continues to do some useful work in science. So he's in some way skeptical about levels, but nonetheless thinks maybe we need them in order to do some useful work. After discussing several different types of levels, he then focuses on what he calls the interaction level, which includes any factor, regardless of size or composition, that has a causal relation to the system and needs to be explained, and is testable by his notion of interventionist causality. I'll give you some examples of this interventionist causality idea a little bit later. So the interaction level, he says, is characterized by conditional independence concerning explanation, which means that if we can explain a phenomenon in terms of a higher level variable, we don't need to explain it as depending on a lower variable. In effect, however, this puts neural processes, psychological processes, social processes, all on the same level, so that the explanation doesn't have to reference any other level defined by different criteria. The only criteria, the only criterion that is used to define this level, this interaction level, is that there are causal relations among the factors. So in this sense, if one's explanation is confined to one level, so defined, then one doesn't have to talk about levels at all. And the concept of levels does no explanatory work. So this is, you might say, a pragmatic kind of levels eliminativism. Despite framing it in terms of levels, we've actually sort of gotten rid of any need to appeal to levels in this type of an account. Woodward goes on to suggest that the interaction explanation is closely tied to the role of different spatial, temporal, or energetic scales in constructing models. So the notion of scales here turns out to be important. Different scales matter specifically as they relate to the strength and the nature of causal interactions. The concept of scales, however, is different from the concept of levels. So, for example, Marcus Aronin notes that differences in time scales could be used to define levels, but scales are continuous, where the boundary between levels should be drawn may not have a clear answer, but nonetheless, people want boundaries between these levels. And Craver and Darden also assume the distinction between levels and scales. And for them, differences in time scales, for example, involve differences in how we measure processes. So it's a pragmatic measuring issue here when it comes to something like scales, rather than drawing boundaries between levels. I think this then sets us up to develop what I'll call a kind of enactive integration. And in this type of integration, the idea is to drop the notion of levels, but to retain the concept of scales. And this, I think, is very much in line with Woodward, so that we can integrate all relevant causal factors that enable the manifestation of a cognitive ability, or in the case of psychiatry, of the type of disorder that we're looking at. This is what Woodward calls level neutrality. And I think in some way, this also is very consistent with Saneka Dehaan's view. Level neutrality, however, according to Woodward, does allow us to talk about causal relations among variables across different levels. But as I've suggested, if one's analysis focuses on causal interaction or the interaction level, then with respect to just these relations, since explanation references only one level, it allows us to bracket talk about levels altogether without explanatory loss. So across a number of domains, I've argued for a concept of integration understood in terms of a dynamical pattern or gestalt. This is an approach that gives up the concept of levels, hierarchy, top-down versus bottom-up distinctions. And as I say, I've argued along with some co-authors in a number of different contexts for this type of approach, contexts that involve the analysis of situated cognition, social cognition, expert performance, and also concepts of self and self disorders. So in terms of psychiatric distinctions between bio, pheno, psychosocial, existential, and so forth, there's no reason to think that neural or bodily processes are causally more basic than psychological or social processes. Again, we might say that we don't have to think in terms of more basic at all, or in terms of levels. So across these domains, one finds a variety of factors or processes that need to be understood as integrated in a gestalt fashion. And here is a list that I've been using of 10 different types of factors. And it's a motley collection, right, that goes from neural processes to social processes, to narrative capacities, to cognitive and reflective processes, and even to environmental affordances and normative factors about how we ought to behave and so forth. And each of these factors can also be, thought in as involving other aspects or patterns in them. So, for example, this phenomenological aspect of pre-reflective experiential aspects. Sometimes phenomenological psychologists talk about disruptions in ipseity, and that's what's at stake here. Others like Dan Zahavi talk about the minimal self or the sense of ownership, the sense of agency. So all those aspects, all those kinds of processes may in fact be implicated here in this kind of factor. So the question then is how to integrate all of these different types of things, and clearly, just to list them is not enough. We need to say specifically how these factors are related. And in the psychiatric context, this has been flagged as an issue. It's not enough to provide a simple list of factors. One has to consider, as Sanaka Dahan puts it, their potential ordering, hierarchy or structure. But in the case of psychiatric disorders and their treatment, the relevant questions precisely pertain to this structure. So let me just mention that when Sanaka argues for a concept of fusion, she argues for that in terms of describing organizational causality. And when she gets to more pragmatic aspects of treatment and clinical matters, she then reverts to the differentiation, the needed differentiation. So I think she realizes that this tension between fusion on the one hand and a set of differentiated factors. Somewhere between a simple list and Dahan's fusion, we need to define causal relations arranged in a non-hierarchical, level-free structure. To be clear, the idea of dynamical causal connections among the various factors and processes is part of the very definition of the notion of a pattern or gestalt that I'm using. And here I'm drawing on the work of Scott Kelso and his notion of a dynamical pattern, or what I sometimes call it, the dynamical gestalt. The relevant notion of causality here is a nonlinear dynamical causality rather than simple reciprocal or circular or organizational causality, right? Because with organizational causality, if we define it in terms of fusion, that's not the way to go. So we don't want levels, but also we don't want fusion. So dynamical causality, that's one term that we might use for this. The issue, however, is what this means in the context of psychiatry. And here, to try to work that out, I have proposed a threefold method for exploring dynamical causality in enactive patterns. And the starting point for getting to this method is actually to look at the phenomenology of skilled performance and expertise. And I think Gerens provides a clue here. In the context of psychiatry, he's discussing a loss of the sense of agency in some schizophrenic delusions, and he references studies of expert performance, where, on some views, expert performance involves the absence of a sense of agency, as one is, as he puts it, on automatic pilot in the flow. He says we are more aware of our agency when learning a musical instrument than when performing a task automatically and successfully. So in this respect, he leads us to a debate about expert performance. And it's very well known in this debate, the model proposed by Hubert Dreyfus for expert performance, or what he calls embodied coping. And he characterizes it as a kind of mindless, non-representational being in the flow. So this is probably a familiar type of analysis that you find cited quite often in phenomenology. Gerens' analysis, however, puts him closer to theorists who argue against Dreyfus that performance involves mindful elements and who conceive of top-down processes where low-order automatic processes of embodied coping are modulated by higher-order reflective, representational, cognitive aspects. So there are a number of theorists, and we'll cite just one set of theorists here that argue for this, but there's quite a few of them who argue against Dreyfus on this. This debate has motivated the development of what has been called a meshed architecture model in performance studies. And this method that I'm trying to outline here, the first part of the threefold method is to reconceive of the mesh of relevant factors not as a hierarchical architecture, but as a dynamical gestalt. So this notion of a mesh as a gestalt of interactive causality is sort of what we're looking for. I'm going to short circuit all of the debates in the performance literature having to do with dance, musical performance, and acting and things like that. And I'm simply going to present the enactivist model here, a kind of enhanced version of the meshed architecture model. Here I have to point to Christensen, Sutton, and McElwain's 2016 article where they outline this notion of a meshed architecture. In contrast to Dreyfus's notion that skilled performance is mindless, they argue that, in fact, cognition does play a role. And there's a kind of meshing between cognition and automatic motor control processes. There's an integration of cognitive and bodily sensory motor processes. Here's what they say. Skill is not a matter of bypassing explicit thought to let habitual actions run entirely on their own, but of building and accessing flexible links between knowing and doing. The forms of thinking and knowing, or the forms of thinking and remembering, which involve a lot of different types of processes they discuss: self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation, selective target control, conscious monitoring, a sense of one's rightly configured body, enhanced pre-reflective awareness, situation awareness, all of the things that Dreyfus says, will interrupt performance and disrupt it. All of these, which can in some circumstances, they say, reach in to animate the subtle kinesthetic mechanisms of skilled performance, must themselves be redescribed as active and dynamic. So the mesh involves, they say, a broadly hierarchical division of control responsibilities, with cognitive control usually focused on strategic aspects of performance and automatic body schematic processes more concerned with implementation. So this initial meshed architecture model is, I've argued, too top-down, too tied to the level idea, and also overly cognitive, where they put really cognition in control of the process, and which will modulate the automatic motor processes that they're describing. So what I've proposed is a more complex, enhanced conception of the meshed architecture, which starts out as hierarchical, but in the end, we try to get away from that type of level discourse. And the first thing is that the control features are not all top-down. Control is rather located on this kind of vertical axis. There are important bottom-up processes that are not automatic. Habitual processes, and well, this concerns how one conceives of habit, it's if you conceive of habit as automatic and repetitive and always doing the same thing, that doesn't really work. So if we think of the body schematic processes as being involved in our habitual type of behavior, there's a kind of flexibility involved there, and control is in a certain way built in. It's a kind of intrinsic control. Secondly, I want to introduce what we might call a horizontal axis that integrates ecological, social, and normative factors. These are factors that also play a role in performance, and often a very important role. And finally, affective processes, which are not mentioned by Christensen and colleagues, affective processes that modulate the dynamics of integration on both vertical and horizontal axes. So these are at least three different types of aspects that have that need to be added to the mix here. So performance, we would say, involves embodied, ecological, extended, enactive processes, which involve themselves coupling relations of brain, body, and environment. And I want to say that although this is a model that develops within the realm of performance studies, it's not just about performance, but it can be applied, again, to situated and social cognition, self-related processes relevant to psychiatry. All of these processes could be mapped onto a meshed architecture. But again, this looks very hierarchical and depends upon notions of different levels. So further explanation requires an account of the dynamical relations among all of these elements, so that we start to think of the mesh more as a dynamical gestalt of processes in which vertical and horizontal are clearly just explanatory abstractions. So on a dynamical gestalt view, neuronal processes are not more basic than social processes. Neural and social processes can be contemporaneous across timescales and involve nonlinear dynamical causality. On this enactive interactionist view, we can give up notions of levels and hierarchies and use interventionist analysis of causal relevance. So the second part of this methodological approach is to appeal to interventionist causality. And this is, again, James Woodward's concept, which allows us to show reciprocal or nonlinear dynamical causality among the elements. And the idea is that an intervention of some sort, now that could be something like a traumatic experience, or it could be a therapeutic intervention on one factor, may shift things around, perhaps bestowing more weight on other factors. And that's the basic start of the interventionist technique, that you target one particular aspect to see whether that causes changes in the other processes that are involved in the gestalt arrangement. So in contrast to Guerin's, for example, this can be more than just a manipulation of an internal mechanism, using medication or affecting neuronal processes. It can be a change in, for example, a social factor, or it can be therapeutic changes in cognitive strategy, bodily or narrative practices, or some combination that can rearrange the entire gestalt. If you talk with therapists, even therapists who promote, for example, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, they will also admit that they don't really follow the doctrine of cognitive behavioral therapy as a kind of scripture, but they in fact use other types of processes, anything that will work. And that ranges from movement or dance therapy to narrative therapy and so forth. So one can use those different therapies as interventions and then see exactly what happens. Clearly, then, using the model of a meshed architecture to map out the important variables and possible causal relevance is only a first step. A second step is to show causal relevance using interventionist strategies. in order to explain the actual meshing of the very different types of factors and processes involved, which range from cognitive to affective to bodily, behavioral, ecological, social, cultural, normative factors. Testing experimentally or clinically their dynamical integration or relations that, defining relations that are enabling or constraining or dynamically causal. The final piece of this three-part method is referred to as coordination dynamics. I think we can even get more specific and detailed in analyzing the factors using dynamical systems models of coordination dynamics, which have been developed by Kelso and his group. So here's a nice paper outlining this approach of coordination dynamics by Tognoli and Kelso and other colleagues. Recent paper, I think it's 2020, where Kelso's idea that dynamics is a language for connecting events from genetic to the mental. And the idea is dynamics is a kind of common factor across all of the diverse factors and processes that make up the dynamical pattern or gestalt. So it's the glue, so to speak, that allows us to start talking about how various processes are related to one another. So the dynamical patterns specify the flow of coordination processes across brain processes, movements, postures, gestures, interactions, and other behaviors, and their ongoing organization. The focus of this paper is on social behavior. And these coordinations can be mathematically characterized as coupled, self-organizing, dynamical systems. In effect, in social interactions, physical processes at different timescales enter into some degree of dynamical coordination. This type of analysis identifies general systems of equations that express the lawful regularities explaining the coordination of such systems, regardless of scale or material substrate. And it identifies, as they put it, emergent phenomena where the whole is not only greater than the sum of its parts, but different too. So with this, the interventionist strategy that we use can gain a more detailed analysis, I believe. So the last part of this, and I think I have a few minutes left to at least talk a little bit about autism spectrum disorder as a test case. So can the concept of a dynamical gestalt open to therapeutic interventions help to sort out some of the complexity involved in autism spectrum disorder? And Dumas and Kelso and Nadel suggest in social cognition, for example, the case of autism provides a testbed for an integrative approach. So here, using the threefold method, we would start with something like this, vertical and horizontal type of arrangement, just to identify the possible factors that we would need to consider in analyzing something like autism. And of course, there's a standard view that says, with respect to cognition, there are theory of mind problems. With respect to, especially to social cognition, there are theory of mind problems. So Baron Cohen, for example, would endorse that idea. And in some cases, one can point to, again, neural processes that involve mirror neurons not functioning properly, or theory of mind mechanism in the brain, the frontal cortex, somehow or other not functioning properly. So on that vertical axis, you find different approaches to autism that we can sort of fit into this mesh. Affect, of course, also plays an important role. someone like Peter Hobson has emphasized that affectivity problems characterize autism. But also, there are a lot of sensory motor problems that can interfere with motor control. There are disrupted patterns in afferent and proprioceptive sensory feedback. Elizabeth Torres, for example, and Maria Brinker have talked about precisely these types of problems in autism. And they are, in fact, very, very much leading to symptoms or characterizations of autistic children who have trouble with motor coordination, postural instability, atypical gait, motor sequencing, and so forth and so on. And we can also think that such motor problems will change the affordance structure of the environment, what children with autism are able to do or not do. And also, it will constrain communicative conversational practices. And in fact, it often leads to differences in how we treat persons with autism. That is to say, as we enter into a conversation with them, our own conversation starts to become, our own practice of conversation starts to change. And we find a kind of dyadic disruption going on. So in effect, all of these different factors seem to be in some way implicated in autism spectrum disorder to varying degrees, of course, according to the severity of the autism. So we can now ask how a therapeutic interaction on one process or factor in the self pattern affects or realigns other processes. So here's an example. Tager, Fussberg, and Anderson have studied conversational ability in children with autism and suggested that impairment in conversational ability is due to deficits in TOM development. Is there I heard some noise, so I'll continue unless there's something you. Okay.
Yes, please go ahead. Perhaps there's someone with the microphone open. Yes,
okay.
Please go ahead.
Right. This study, then, they're looking at conversation in autistic children. And they hypothesize that, well, problems in conversation might be due to theory of mind problems. And so they devise an intervention, a theory of mind training intervention to improve cognitive ability that will then, they think, lead to improvements in communicative behavior. And Hardwin and colleagues actually tested this hypothesis, training children with ASD on tasks that employ theory of mind, cognitive abilities, to understand mental states in others, focusing on beliefs, emotional states, and pretense. And they compared conversational abilities prior to this training and then post-training. And they talk about distinguishing different types of responses, a distinction between a simple answer as opposed to a developed answer, as opposed to sort of automatic repetitive answers, or something that's totally unclear. And what they find is this, that after training on theory of mind tasks, quote, children did learn to pass cognitive tasks, learning emotional and tasks concerning emotional and belief understanding. However, there was no corresponding advance in social communication skills. Specifically, no improvement in the development of conversation and no increase in the use of mental state terms in speech was found. And they basically stayed at the simple answer level of their behavior. So it looks like improving theory of mind, at least in this particular experiment, doesn't lead to changes in conversational ability or improve social interaction in this respect. So Another question would be whether early intervention that improved motor coordination could have an effect on social interaction and improve communicative behavior. So this would be a different type of intervention using a different kind of therapy. It turns out, however, that people have tried this and there's no clear answer, but there are some interesting hypotheses. So people have been using dance movement therapy as a kind of intervention for children with autism. Basically, they're reporting mixed results. And these may be due to variations across autism spectrum disorder and also variations in therapeutic programs. And I would say there could be variations in any of the various factors that we've been talking about that might interfere or constrain anything like a straightforward success in this respect. Finally, Kostrubiak and colleagues, referencing Kelso's coordination dynamics approach, compared 20 children with autism with 21 typically developing children on motor coordination in intentional motor tasks. And they correlated this to a questionnaire socioadaptive quotient scores that measure communication ability and socialization. This involves things like saying please or thanks or excuse me at appropriate times. And again, they found no notable differences between children with autism and typically developing children in simple perceptual motor coordination tasks, but they did find that children with autism show increasing deficits in more demanding interpersonal coordination tasks when coordination patterns were intentionally requested by the experimenter. And this then correlated to the poor scores on the social quotient questionnaire. And so they say, their conclusion is, this leaves the hypothetical and to be tested possibility that by manipulating motor coordination parameters in autistic children, their coordination abnormalities could be reduced and their social deficits perhaps alleviated. I think it's more complicated than that. Increased deficits in communication behavior were apparent when they were socially interacting, but that was complicated by the experimenter requests. Plus, there's the fact that in other disorders, there are anomalies in motor coordination that don't lead to social deficits. So what this suggests, I think, is that it's not a one-way causal relation that we're looking at, but some more nuanced, dynamical, nonlinear type of relation between social interaction, communication behavior, and motor coordination. So accordingly, a more detailed dynamical coordination study may be required to sort out such relations. Therapeutic interventions also might be based on considering the specific contexts where these different therapies are carried out. Communicative interactions may be very different outside of the lab, in the home, when, for example, children with autism are interacting with parents. And there are some, I think, insightful ethnographic studies about this. So looking at the meshed Gestalt idea, trying to understand the integration of all these different factors, we need always to look not just at one factor and settle anything, but we have to, again, intervene at different points in the Gestalt to see what exactly happens with the rest. So my conclusion on this dynamical Gestalt view, one can give up explanatory concepts of levels or hierarchy, but still use interventionist analysis to identify causal relevance. And the kind of causality we're looking at is typically nonlinear dynamical causality that allows useful distinctions to be made between various factors and processes, and at the same time can account for their integration. And in the end, we can provide a fuller dynamical systems explanation in which there may be recursive and looping processes that we need to consider, because it is, in fact, always a complex thing we're looking at. Okay, thank you very much. And if you have your smartphone with you and are interested in downloading papers, you can, aim at these two different codes. That's it.